Now, maybe you haven't realized, but a major political realignment is underway. And it is one that represents the most significant shift in global alliances since the Cold War. This realignment is not really driven by China's aggressive expansion, but by the destabilizing actions of the United States under the current executive team, which is systematically eroding America's alliance network and pushing even its closest partners toward Beijing. There definitely is a striking diplomatic pattern. In January 2026 alone, four core US allies, Canada, the United Kingdom, South Korea, and Finland, sent their leaders to Beijing to reset relations with China. Germany's chancellor is scheduled to follow shortly thereafter. These visits are unprecedented in their timing, concentration, and political symbolism. These are not peripheral or opportunistic states hedging their bets, they are central pillars of the US led international system. Each country's strategic importance underscores the severity of the shift. Canada is America's largest trading partner and shares the world's longest undefended border with the United States. And South Korea hosts tens of thousands of US troops and relies on American security guarantees to deter North Korea. Finland just joined NATO in 2023 specifically to counter Russian aggression. The United Kingdom has been America's closest diplomatic and military partner since World War II. Yet, all four choose to engage China directly and within the same month. These were not routine diplomatic visits. In several cases, they marked the first such visits in many years. Canada's Prime Minister was the first in 8 years to visit China. South Korea President made his first visit since taking office, and the UK's Prime Minister had not visited Beijing since 2018. The timing and coordination suggest deliberate strategic recalibration rather than coincidence. This diplomatic shift is traced directly to the US policy decisions. That turning point came after Trump's Liberation Day tariff in April 2025, which signaled to allies that the United States was willing to weaponize trades against even friendly nations. That situation escalated further when Trump threatened to seize Greenland from NATO ally Denmark and reached a critical point with threats of 100% tariffs on Canadian goods related to the last China trade. When multiple independent actors make the same strategic move simultaneously, it reflects a fundamental reassessment of risk, and that reassessment is about American reliability. Let me detail the concrete outcomes of this visit. First, Canada's Prime Minister negotiated a deal with China that reduced tariff on Chinese electric vehicles in exchange for improved market access for Canadian agricultural products. Shortly after, he publicly stated that China had become a more predictable trading partner than the United States, a remarkable declaration from a NATO ally. He also delivered a phrase that became emblematic of middle power anxiety. If we're not at the table, we're on the menu. This was widely interpreted as a warning to other US allies that they must band together against coercion from superpowers, and especially from Washington. Trump's response to Canada was hostile and counterproductive. He threatened sweeping tariffs, accused Canada of serving as a conduit for Chinese goods, and warned that China would eat Canada alive. While these threats were dismissed as bluster by Canadian leadership, other allies drew a deeper conclusion. US threats were increasingly hollow and erratic. This perception hardened when Trump criticized the UK for engaging China, despite planning his own visit to Beijing, exposing the US as a blatant hypocrisy. Beyond rhetoric, let me explain what are the financial mechanisms driving this realignment. These diplomatic engagements are producing tangible economic agreements that gradually shift global capital flows away from the dollar dominated systems. The UK secured visa free travel, reduced tariff on exports like Scotch whisky, and a broader strategic partnership framework. These agreements are not symbolic, they form the infrastructure of alternative trading networks that reduce dependence on American intermediation. Visa free travel facilitates business relationships independent of US oversight. Bilateral traffic reductions encourage trade settlement outside the dollar system. Over time, these arrangements contribute to a slow but persistent decoupling from the US denominated financial architecture. Now, of course, while no single deal is revolutionary, the cumulative effect is profound. The pattern becomes clearer when examining who has I recently visited Beijing. Leaders from France, Germany, and Ireland, core members of the European Union, have also engaged China at high levels. Combined with Canada and the UK, these countries represent over $15 trillion in GDP. The scale of this engagement signals that China is positioning itself as an alternative center of economic gravity rather than a peripheral partner. In that sense, Xi Jinping approach is a masterclass in strategic patience. While Trump relies on threats, tariff, and inflammatory rhetoric, Xi represents China as stable, predictable, and rule bound. Amazing, right? During meetings with European leaders, she emphasized adherence to international law, a thinly veiled critique of Trump's threat to seize Greenland and other countries around and pressure Canada into becoming a US state. The contrast in messaging is stark. China offers order and stability, while the United States appears chaotic and coercive. Even within the US, policymakers recognize the danger. Several senior US legislators acknowledging that American strategy is backfiring by driving allies toward China instead of uniting them against it. This is framed not as partisan criticism, but as a recognition of strategic failure. The broader strategic implications are severe. For decades, US power rested on two pillars: military alliances and economic networks. In that sense, Trump is undermining both. Both. NATO solidarity is weakened by territorial threats against allies, while trade wars damage economic trust. As a result, allies are increasingly building alternative security and economic arrangements that explicitly exclude the United States. Finland's participation is highlighted as especially revealing. Despite joining NATO to counter Russia, Finland's prime minister engaged China, Russia, primary backer, just 2 years later. This suggests that even countries facing immediate or authoritarian threats now view the US unreliability as a greater danger than Chinese influence. South Korea's decision is similarly significant. Facing an existential nuclear threat from North Korea, South Korea depends heavily on US security guarantees. Yet, its president still chooses to engage China directly, signaling a willingness to diversify security relationships despite the risks. Now, when a nation is willing to risk displacing its primary security guarantor, that means that it has already concluded that that guarantor can no longer be fully trusted. Financial markets are already pricing in permanent US strategic decline. The dollar's reserve currency status depends on global confidence in US stability and leadership. That confidence is eroding as countries establish bilateral currency swap lines, settle trade in local currencies, and build financial systems that bypass the American control. The combined GDP of countries sending leaders to Beijing exceeds $8.7 trillion, representing sophisticated economies with deep capital markets. Their simultaneous pivots toward China creates alternative poles of economic gravity that will continue drawing capital away from US assets. No, a bold prediction. I think that by the end of 2026, at least 10 additional US allies will have sent senior leaders to Beijing to reset relations. The realignment will not occur through a coordinated attack on the dollar, but through countless individual decisions by central banks and sovereign wealth funds seeking to reduce exposure to US risk. Yeah, this shift will be gradual, subtle, and largely unnoticed until it becomes irreversible. Ultimately, China does not need to defeat the United States militarily or economically. Instead, the US is undermining itself by alienating the allies that made it a superpower in the first place.